Hi, Steve Gale here. Today what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce DynamoDB and just give a brief demonstration of using DynamoDB from the command line and also from Python script. First of all, what I might do is I might just quickly talk about the environment and configuration. So I'm running DynamoDB locally on Ubuntu, and first of all, for configuration, what I needed to do was I needed to install the default JRE for Ubuntu because the DynamoDB runs locally as a Java application. Because I was using Python, the next thing I needed to do was to install Python and using sudo apt install Python. And then following on from that, I just wanted to make sure I had the latest version of pip. And I also needed to install curl because curl was the preferred mechanism of downloading DynamoDB. The other thing I needed to do was to install the AWS CLI for Ubuntu, and I used sudo apt install AWS CLI from that. The next step was to download DynamoDB using CURL, and got the latest there, and then unzipping that into a local folder. And so following on from that, to run DynamoDB, this is the command to run DynamoDB, and basically it's using Java. So we've got a path to the DynamoDB local library that we unzipped, and also the jar file. The next thing I needed to do was to configure AWS, the AWS CLI, and using the AWS configure command. AWS had already been installed, so the AWS CLI had already been installed. And what I did was I just used some dummy default access keys for local use. So it asked for an access key ID, a secret access key, and a default region, which I used US West, and default output format as JSON. So that's fine, and because we're running it locally, it actually makes sense to set a local variable, local equals, endpoint URL http localhost 8000. When you're running DynamoDB locally, once we run DynamoDB locally, what will happen is that'll fire up on localhost port 8000, so we can integrate with that. Additionally, in the configuration, I also installed via pip boto 3, which is the AWS libraries for the AWS SDK for Python. And then that was all that was required to set up the local environment for running DynamoDB locally. So once we've done that, and the next thing we need to do is have a look at some scripts. So what I've done is I've created some test scripts in a folder called room data. And the first script I'm going to look at is the create table script. Actually, no, the first script I'll look at is the list table script. So what I can do here is I can say AWS DynamoDB list tables, and I use $local. And $local on the end, as I mentioned before, will specify the endpoint to be localhost 8000. If I was running this in the cloud, then I would replace that endpoint with endpoint URL with my URL to my DynamoDB in the cloud. So what I can do is I can run this script list tables here, and so if you can see here, I'm in this folder DynamoDB room data, which is this folder here. So what I can do is I can run that script, which is list tables with a capital T .sh, and you can see I have no tables. So what that shows is I'm able to use the AWS CLI. I'm able to connect to DynamoDB on that local port 8000, and I get a list tables, and you can see what's returned is basically an empty set. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the next script, which is create table room data. And what this script is going to do is it's going to create a table for me, AWS DynamoDB create table. And the table name that I'm going to create is room data table. And with my attribute definitions, what I've got is I've got two attributes. I've got one attribute called room, which is a string. The attribute type is a string. And another attribute called sample date time ID, which is going to be a date time, but it's going to be stored as a string. So you can see type S, attribute type S is a string. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to combine these two attributes in a key schema. And the key schema I'm going to use is I'm going to use the room attribute as the hash, and I'm going to use the sample date time ID as the range. So the combination of the hash and the range will give me two keys that I can combine together to use as one key in the when I'm querying the table. So essentially, why I've chosen to do it this way, if I use the room as the hash and the sample date time as the range, then I can run queries like give me all of the times for a particular room. So this is the approach that I've taken. So what I can do is I can run that script. So and I'll run that script, create table room data.sh, and you can see what it returns. It's run successfully, and what it's returned is some information about the table. So it's got my attribute definitions here. It's got the room data table. It's got the key schema, so it's returned the key schema that I've used, and table status is active, and some other information about provision, throughput, and capacity, and so forth. So now if I go back and go back down here and I run my list tables command again, listtables.sh, you can see here that in my table names I've created that room data table. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to put some data in there, and what I've got is I've got a script here, batch write line item. And what this is going to do is it's going to essentially do a batch write with a number of different items into the table. So each record in the table is essentially called an item. And so here you can see request request items, room data table. And I'm doing a put request, and this is my first item. So I've got the room, and the room type is E220. The sample date time, I've got a sample date time, and I've got a temperature measurement for that room at that time. Similarly, I've got another put request, which is another item, which will be essentially another record, which has different room, a different time, and a different temperature, and so on and so on. And you can see I've got a number of these put requests of different items in the batch script. And ultimately, this batch script is running to $local or HTTP localhost 8000. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run that command, that script, which is, and I'll just I'll copy the path and I'll paste it in there. Oops. Here we go. And it's returned unprocessed items, nothing. So, which means that basically it's executed successfully. So what I can do now is I can do a data query to have a look at the data, and I'll do this in two different ways. First of all, I'll do a data query via script, And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to run this DynamoDB query, and I'm going to query the room data table. And the condition I'm going to use is I'm going to say for room, and room is equal to E223. So I've got a number of different rooms that I loaded in there, but I'm going to run this query specifically around to return only the rooms for E223. So let's run this. Copy the relative path, and I'll paste that in there, and I'll just put .dash in front of it, and I'll run this one. Oops. And you can see what it's returned is it will return all of the entries where the room data was equal to E223. So you can see here's our items, here's the room, here's the temperature, and here's the date time. So the temperature, this date time was 26.37. The next one, I've got the same room, different temperature, different date time. So there's a number of different records that have been returned from this query. And you can see here down the bottom, I've got a summary, count equals 16, and so forth. So I can also run a date range. So in this example here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this query here against the room data table. And I'm going to, my condition expression is room equals room and sample date time between start date and an end date. So here I've got my room is E223. The start date I've specified as the start date, and here the end date here, this is the end date here, and again running on $local. So let's try running this one. So I'll just copy the relative path of that and paste that in there, and just go back and put a dot in front of there. And you can see here I've returned. This time I've returned 14 records between those date ranges, and these are all my items. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to look at a query in Python, and so let's have a look at a Python-based query. So this is essentially the same query that I've just run, which is the date range query. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this in Python as opposed to using the AWS CLI. So the main thing I need to do is I need to import boto3, which is the AWS library, which gives me the ability to connect to the AWS SDK. And I'm also going to import key as well from the conditions. And we're also going to be using pprint as well. So I've got this function query and project rooms. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a DynamoDB connection to the endpoint URL of localhost 8000. We're going to specify the table as the room data table. So that's the table that we're going to be using. And here's my response, here's my query, table.query, and I'm going to be getting room, sample date, time, and temperature as my expression of the projection expression of the things that I want to return. And I'm using room here, so I'm just replacing this with room. But I've got a key condition expression, and my key condition is I want the room equal to room name, and the room name gets passed in over here, and my sample date time between a date range, start date range and an end date range. And you can see the date range is going to be passed in over here. And then what I'm going to return is I'm going to return all of the items that come back in the response from that query request. Here's the main code. So in the main code, I'm specifying the room that I want is E223. Here's my query range and my date range. So that's my start date range and that's my end date range that I'm going to pass over as my date range here. And you can see here's the call. Query and project rooms, query room, so E223, query range from this range to this range. So I'm passing over the query range. And what that will return is a whole bunch of items as rooms. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to iterate through those. And for room in rooms, I'm going to print out the sample date, time, the room, and the temperature being measured at that time. So what I'll do is I'll just run this. So I can just run Python file in terminal. And we should see this execute down here if I go to the end. And here we go. So here I'm running my Python code and using Python 3. And here's my date times, here's my room, and here's the temperature measurements being printed out. Okay, so just finally to clean up, I've got one more Python script, which is this one here, which is delete table, which is going to basically delete my table. So let's have a look at this one. So first of all, we're importing boto 3, and then we're going to call this function delete room data table, and we're going to make the connection to the endpoint URL localhost 80,000 or 8,000, sorry. And we're going to call DynamoDB table room data table. So that's going to be the table that we're going to use. Then we're going to call table delete. And in the main code, my Python code, we're going to call delete the room data table. So we're going to call this function, and then we'll print room table deleted. So let's run that, and we'll run this here. And if we have a look, you can see here we've successfully completed. So we've got room data table deleted has been printed, which is what we'd expect. So now if we were to list the tables, go back and list our tables, date range, date query, date room data query, batch writer item, list tables. You can see here that we've got no tables in our DynamoDB database. So I hope that was helpful. That's just a quick demo of using DynamoDB. I've run it locally, but equally I could substitute HTTP localhost 8000 for an endpoint URL in AWS. And similarly, I could, when I used AWS configure, I could use my cloud access key, a cloud secret access key, specify the region that's where my DynamoDB is located, and the output format. And instead of exporting local, I could export that endpoint, and I could run these scripts against my my cloud DynamoDB database. Thanks very much for your time.